All right, so for period, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
No.
No, what I was talking about, like the Pope, talking about a Western Pope that was cracking down on polytheistic views. Do you have a name of that Pope?
No, not off the top of my head. I'm sorry. So for period 3, we have 600 to 1450. In period 3, this is really going to be the golden age for China, and this is going to be the time where China really has its like kind of peak of power. But then by the end of period 3, the Ming Chinese are going to make the decision to stop exploring the world and really start to isolate China. So all in period 3, it's going to be like the rise of China as a really centralized, powerful force, and then the fall of China. So, say it again.
What's the percentage for
So from this point on, it gets really easy with dates because we're all in the CE, and then it gets easy with percentages, 20% of the exam for each period the rest of the way through. So we'll start with China. China, after the fall of Han, went through a period of warring states. And just like the Qin used legalism and they were really strict, we see the emergence of a group in China called the Sui. They come along in 589, and they stay in power until 607. And the Sui were also legalists. And they were also builders of big technology. They started the construction of the Grand Canal, which linked the north of China to the south. They had 2 really huge rivers in China, but those rivers ran east to west. So north and south were pretty divided before the construction of the Grand Canal. The unfortunate part for the Sui is that the pace of conquest by the Sui was just so fast that they weren't able to keep power. So this is all China. So after the Sui will come the Tang period. A lot of people really look at this as a period of like a lot of innovation in China, a lot of trade. The Tang are definitely going to embrace trade more so than any other group. So the Tang are going to do a lot of things. They are going to go back to Confucianism, right? And they are going to institute an examination system. So they say, okay, we're going to use Confucianism, but we're going to go a step farther to try to identify the people that are going to be best to govern, and we're going to actually institute exams. One of the other things that the Tang do for China, which will be a long-term solution to their governmental problems, is they create 6 departments in the government to manage over different parts of life, right? So like in the United States, we have like a minister of education, someone in charge of defense. Well, the Tang Chinese introduced that same idea. So even though China is still centralized, they still have an emperor that ultimately is in charge, they have these 6 departments that make it a lot easier for them to govern in a way that is, just a bit more efficient. So this is a period where the Chinese are really feeling themselves. They believe they are the center. I mean, it's true. They thought they were the center of the world, and they, essentially told people, if you want to trade with us, you have to participate in this tribute system. So you had to come before the Chinese emperor in this elaborate ritual of bowing. You would then present the emperor with a gift, and then the emperor would bestow Chinese goods on you. And at this time, this tribute system was kind of viewed as like almost charity. Like the Chinese were going to do you a favor by allowing you access to their goods. Now, in later periods, especially under the Song, this becomes more like bribery. And they were giving the Mongols thousands and thousands of pounds of silk as a way to try to keep them at bay. But in the earliest period, the tribute system was really a demonstration of how much power China had and how much everybody wanted access to their goods. So during the Tang period, I'm just going to continue it up here. At the beginning, they embraced Buddhism. They give Buddhists special tax exemptions. We see the construction of a number of massive Buddhist temples in China. So this is really going to be the period where China is the most embracing of outside influence. Now, that embrace of Buddhism is going to be pretty short-lived because once the Tang, largely because of their own corruption and mismanagement of the government, once they run into problems, they blame the Buddhists. So Buddhists become the scapegoat of the Tang period. All right, so Buddhists are embraced for a while, but then they're just blamed for everything that goes wrong. Yeah?
Is this the period of Neo-Confucianism or no?
So any period that they go back to Confucianism is technically Neo, like a new period of Confucianism. And in this time, they are fusing a little bit of Buddhism into, the Confucianism.
And then that stops when they don't embrace Buddhism anymore?
Right, exactly. By the time the Ming come along, their Neo-Confucianism is to try to eliminate any of those outside influences. So in the 900s, the Tang, because of, honestly a lot of their own, issues with corruption and mismanagement and overexpanding, they fall. They'll be replaced by the Song. There's a very brief warring states period between the Tang and the Song, but this time it only lasts about 60 years. The Song, they essentially take all of this and say, yeah, this stuff worked really well, and we could pretty much attribute everything that we attributed governmentally to Tang right over to Song. So they're Confucianists, they're still using Mandate of Heaven, they're still using the tribute system. So all of those attributes of Tang government are relevant to Song government. All right, so Confucianism, Mandate of Heaven, what year was what? You got it?
Yeah, because I was looking there and I realized it was over there.
Oh, okay, got you. No, you're good. Again, when we talk about tribute system in the Tang period, this is where we talk about it more as a system of bribery. Right? They are trying to prevent the northern nomads from attacking by giving them what they think will kind of hold them off. This is also a period for Song China of immense technological development, gunpowder, printing, mechanical clock, a lot of technological innovations in China at this time. Now, unfortunately, China is going to be taken over at the end of the Song period by the Mongols. And we'll talk about the Mongols as kind of their own entity. And after Mongol period will be the Ming period. So we'll leave right now period 3 with just Sui and Tang and Song. And then when we're talking about the Mongols, we'll look at the Mongol influence on China and kind of contrast that to the Mongol influence on Russia. Right, so just understand that after Song will be about 100-year period of Mongol rule of China called the Yun Dynasty, and then after that is going to be the Ming, right? And we'll get into those, and Ming we'll kind of get into at the beginning of period 4. Yeah.
So in Song, the tribute system, those people kind of used it their own
Yeah, the northern nomads were like, yeah, keep giving us, silk and then we won't invade you. So it was a period where the Song were not as effectively able to manage that northern border. So they were just paying to try to keep the people at bay. Go ahead, Christina.
So like, with all these like new dynasties, how did they gain power? After like a bunch of periods, they just like became.
Yeah, militarily, typically these are like individual families that had these massive land holdings and built a bigger army than the other families that were competing for power, and then were able to just suppress the other groups militarily. I mean, that's a massive oversimplification of how it happened, but generally there's a lot of competition in warfare. Whoever had the biggest army was going to be the one eventually to take over. All right, so that leaves us, that has us leaving China for a bit and going back to Europe. And I'm actually going to create a bit more space in the middle of the board if you wanted to take a quick picture of China. All right, so for Western Europe, Western Rome falls in 476, and Western Europe will go into a period called feudalism. So for feudalism, this is a really decentralized time governmentally. Right? So people are living on these feudal manors, which are these really huge farms, where they have a feudal lord who's making the rules and laws for them. So this is a period where, again, government is really decentralized in Western Europe. The feudal lords have the power. Kings were essentially figureheads without any real power over their people. Right? So this is going to be the time where we refer to as the Dark Age in Western Europe. Right around 500 to about 1000 will be the really kind of intense period of the Dark Ages. Right, so this will be the period where Western Europe, is kind of falling behind, and Eastern Europe is ahead. Right, what we see right around 1000 is there is the start of urbanization, right, centered around trade on the Mediterranean. So people in Western Europe are starting to have kind of an alternative to just farming. The other thing is after 500 years of Dark Age, there's good enough farming in Europe that not everybody needs to farm, so there's not as much need for agricultural labor. So we start to see a bit of that urbanization. Now we're going to run Eastern Europe and Western Europe side by side and then together and then divide them again because they're really linked, right? In a lot of ways, they're going to be linked by something called the Crusades. They're going to be linked by their response to the Black Plague. So in Eastern Europe at this time, we have the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines are really centralized. Yeah?
In Western Europe, were they still using specialization of labor for, like, when they urbanized, or?
Yeah, once you start moving into cities, we see that urbanization, you pretty much always have specialized laborers. So you have your merchants, your artisans, your shopkeepers. We start to see the rise of, even restaurants, and people need places to sleep in the cities. Yeah?
What caused the Dark Ages? Like, what was it going
Just the fall of centralized government.
Okay. And
So-
what was going on?
A lot of agriculture, but a lot of small-scale competitive agriculture. So if I'm a feudal lord and Jada's the Lord right next door to me. We're not like trading with each other. We're competing. And I'm probably intermittently attacking her land to try to take over for her. Right? So this is a period where, with the exception of the Roman Catholic Church, there's really no centralizing force in Western Europe. So kind of looming in Western Europe is the Catholic Church, and they are a pretty big force. At one point, they own 1/3 of the land in Western Europe. So the church is there, as that strong force, but they don't have that political power that, Rome, had in the past. Without trying to throw too much at you, which is kind of funny to say already because I know I've already thrown so much at you, the Catholic Church is going to try to create more of a centralized political authority, and very briefly under a guy named Charlemagne, he's able to build an empire in the center of Europe, modern-day Germany. But then after his death, his sons are not able to keep it together. Then the Catholic Church thinks that the construction of the Holy Roman Empire would be the answer, a more kind of democratic, in a way, solution, which we'll talk more about the Holy Roman Empire in period 4. But for the most part, you want to know for Western Europe at this time, feudalism, decentralization. So in the Byzantine Empire, their emperors were definitely utilizing religion to justify their power. Right? It was really an extension of Rome. Right? And despite the fact that we call it the Byzantine Empire, it's really just an extension of Rome. They were really tied into trade. Right? They sat at the crossroads of Africa, Europe, and Asia. So if you wanted to trade by land, you were essentially going to have to go through the Byzantine Empire. At their peak of power, the Byzantines, we're talking about right around the 500s, so they're actually like a little bit left in period 2, and then that transition over into period 3. That's where they get their biggest, under a guy named Justinian. I don't remember Justinian's years, sorry. I know he's in the 500s, so I'm not sure his exact start and end point. But Justinian is worth noting because he also creates a law code. And Justinian believed that people should be governed by laws, not the whims of their leaders. And that notion of having that law code that was equally applied to all people is something that will continue on. The Romans had the idea of more of a standardized law code, as did Justinian in the 500s. Right, so these law codes generally were a way to just try to maintain order, try to keep the poorest class of people happy. After the 500s, the Byzantine Empire kind of shrinks a little bit, but they will continue to be an empire all the way until 1453. Right, that's when the Ottomans will finally knock the Byzantines out of their position, and Byzantines will fall. So 1054 is when Christendom, all of Christianity, is going to divide itself for the first time. So the Roman Catholic popes were not happy with all the power that was being exerted by the Byzantine emperors. So in 1054, they were just at a point where they could not come to any sort of religious compromise. And the Roman Catholic Pope excommunicated the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine emperor and said, okay, you're not part of our church. And then the emperor did the same thing to the Pope. And after that, Christianity was really divided. In the Eastern side, they didn't believe in saints or idol worship. So they thought that like idols were, just an extension of polytheism. And they also didn't believe that the Pope should have like such an authoritative position in the church. So on the eastern side, they were creating a religion that was, adhering a bit more to the text of the Bible. And they were saying, we don't see anything about saints, we don't see anything about idols, we definitely don't see anything about the Pope. So Christianity is broken for the first time. It won't be the last. In period 4, we'll talk about the Protestant Reformation. In 1080, a guy named Pope Urban II comes out and says, okay, we need to work together. The East and the Western Christians need to work together to go and retake the Holy Land. There was a group of Muslims called the Seljuk Turks who had taken over Jerusalem, and Pope Urban II called on all Christians to take it back. Right? So while we've been talking about everything so far in period 3, the looming force that's building the world is Islam, right? And we'll talk about that as its own, kind of section. So Islam starts in the early 600s and then builds from there. So I know it feels like we haven't brought that up, so it's not happening yet, but it's there. So 1080, when the Crusades happen, there's a really strong Islamic empire called the Seljuk Turks.
Okay, so you said that in Eastern Europe, they're not really, they didn't believe that the Pope really had like a big place. So did they still listen to Pope Urban II when they said they needed to go to the Holy Land anyway? Or?
Well, so when Urban II makes this call, it is a point of compromise between the two Christian churches that they need to take back the Holy Land. So there's more of a détente period than there is a reconciliation. So they're like, okay, we have a common enemy, so let's work together. So the idea of the Crusades is to reclaim the Holy Land. And then Pope Urban also wanted to reunite Christians. Right? So he really had a dual goal. Right? Definitely wanted the Holy Land back for Christians, but also wanted to reunite Christians. By the 1200s, both goals had failed. They didn't reclaim the Holy Land, and actually the Western Christians antagonized the Byzantines, and attacked them at the end of the Crusades. So once that period of crusading is over, the Holy Land is still in the hands of an Islamic empire, and Christianity is still really fragmented and even worse than it was arguably way back here. The positive effect of the Crusades is it does open trade back up. Western Europeans realized how many goods were coming out of the East, Asia, Indian Ocean trade that they wanted access to. So they start doing a lot of trade again. Question? So that trade unfortunately brought with it a lot of interaction, which led to disease. And by 1346, we're talking about the Black Plague hitting Europe really hard. Estimates are anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of all the population is wiped out.
Why was trade growing because of the Crusades?
It was just more the access that Western Europeans got to goods that they still wanted, even once they came back to Western Europe. So it was almost like they were part of this Silk Road in period 2, where they had access to goods from Asia. Then they were in this dark age, they didn't have any goods and just kind of forgot. And now it's like, okay, well, we're back in a period where there were people that had extra money and they were able to buy some luxury goods. So now they wanted access again. Yeah, Joseph.
So
Yeah, it just didn't hit Asia in nearly as hard of a percentage of their population.
When were Europe's Middle Ages?
So people use this term Dark Ages or Middle Ages. In general, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance is like the Middle Ages.
Okay.
So people will at times call this the Middle Ages, and then 1000 to 1450 as like the High Middle Ages. So,
Thank you.
Did the Crusades end feudalism?
So after the period of Crusades, what we're going to see is the rise of stronger monarchs in Western Europe. So the feudalism is going to slow down, but it's really the Black Plague that's going to kill feudalism in Europe. So after the Black Plague, there was this huge labor shortage. Yeah. Well, into a single Christianity again. Like, he wanted to reclaim all Christians. So, once the Black Plague hits, huge labor shortage. The way that Europe responds to the labor shortage is going to decide pretty much everything that happens in Europe in the next, I don't know, whatever it is, 800 years. So in the West, they decide that they are going to allow free labor. Right? And no more serfdom. So you are welcome to go out and sell your labor to the highest bidder. And in feudalism, serfs were essentially property of their feudal lords, and now serfs are free. So what we see is a lot of these serfs are going to head into those cities. There's going to be more urbanization. And in those cities, we'll see the development of a strong middle class. Right? And that development of strong middle class is going to completely change Western Europe. The middle class is going to start to become wealthier and wealthier over time. They're going to be the motivators behind the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. They're going to be the people that are going to ally with the monarchs that get stronger. So this rise of a middle class in the western part of Europe has massive impacts for Europe in the next, few centuries. In the East, they decide that they are going to harshly enslave the serfs. All right, and they say, look, not only are you not free, but if you try to escape, you and your whole family will be killed for that. Right? So it was just instituting a system where nobles or lords had all the power. So what happens in the East is you get a really strong noble class that really has the power and very weak monarchs. And the absence of a middle class in Eastern Europe is really going to stunt their development for hundreds of years. Because all of the growth of not all, but a good chunk of the growth of Western Europe is going to come from that middle class. Well, in Eastern Europe, they don't have a middle class. Bless you. All right, and then this is going to set the stage for the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. All right, and when we get to period 4, we'll talk about how that decision had massive impact. But in my opinion, this, and I've said it to my own students, this is probably the biggest change that happens, in this course, because of how much it alters the path of Western Europe. Right, Western Europe goes on to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the age of exploration, and then they're dominating the entire world. Right? And if it wasn't for the development of this middle class, if they had made the same decision they made in the East, who knows where Western Europe would be. Yeah?
Black Plague, they called it Mongols, right?
The Black Plague was during Mongols, right? Okay, so I'm going to try to give you Islam in about 10 minutes and the Mongols about 10 minutes. I'm officially an hour off my pace.
Yeah.
So what we'll probably do is by noon, I'll try to get you to maybe the end of period 5. And then if you guys could come in during Surge this week, I could do a review for period 6. But I know you guys probably arranged rides to pick you up at noon, so we'll do what we could get to by noon, and then we'll do anything else during Surge. But I had the best of intentions to stick to a really strict 30 minutes per period, but we're 2 hours in and we're still in period 3. So that's on me. That's not your fault. All right, I'm moving to Islam. Yeah, so we are still in period 3. So for period 3, right at the very beginning of period 3, we started to see the emergence of Islam. I'm not going to talk much about the religious foundations of Islam, but more about the kind of political foundations and the empires that go along with it. So if you're still a little bit confused about the religious side, that's something that I would say maybe take a little bit of time reviewing. So for Islam as an empire, the earliest Muslims were, traders, right? And they, in the Arabia where Islam was born, there was a lot of trade caravans and there was a lot of competition amongst trading families for those trade routes. So when we see the emergence of, Muhammad and his group of followers, and they first conquer Arabia, that's going to kind of open up, the Middle East to the religion of Islam almost secondarily, right? And I say that, Islam was an empire that had a religion, right? Not a religion that built an empire, right? Because we think about it the other way around. Like that Islam came out and like the people wanted to conquer the world to spread Islam. Now the people were conquering the world to spread trade and take over trade routes, and then they were also, indirectly or in some cases directly spreading their religion. So once Islam as an empire take roots, we refer to the first Islamic empires. We don't use the term empire, but we use the term caliphate. Right, so the term caliphate just really means an empire, right? The term caliph, right, was the leaders of that Islamic empire. So at first there was, one Islam, and everyone was pretty much in agreement that, Muhammad was the leader. And then we start to see a little bit of division in the Islamic world between Sunni Muslims that thought that leadership that the leadership of the Islamic community should be by election.
The Sunni and Shia division was after Muhammad.
Right.
Because they were
Yeah.
arguing whether to take over.
Exactly. It's an argument of leadership once Muhammad is gone. So in the Shia mindset, they believed that leadership had to be by bloodline. There were some doctrine differences between Sunnis and Shias, and it's definitely, a little bit of an understatement to not talk a little bit more about that. But I would just, again, say for the sake of time, we have to maybe kind of skip past some of that. So the first of the Islamic caliphates was called the Umayyad Caliphate. They're from 661 to 750. They are a Sunni caliphate. They spread their empire to the Middle East and the northern portion of Africa. And the thing that made people in the Islamic world a little bit uncomfortable with the Umayyad is that they actually embrace foreigners and other people. And they saw value into allowing non-Muslims into the government. So the way that they governed was, I was trying to think. I had like a comparison that went out of my mind. It will come back, but. So they allowed non-Muslims into the government. I was thinking about the Mughals. Sorry, that's where it was. So in the earliest Mughal period, and I'll talk about the Mughals in period 4, but they allowed like non-Muslims to govern. They were really tolerant. That was the connection I was thinking to make with the Umayyad. You know, the issue with the Umayyad is they make leadership hereditary. And so then people were like, wait, we thought that we were doing leadership by election. Now you're making leadership hereditary. You're allowing non-Muslims into the government. You know, and it just ultimately, you know, made it so that the Umayyad, which was the name of the ruling family, they just lost, support. But they built a big empire. They were really open to trade. This is a period of a lot of, trade and technology. Yeah.
Okay, so they were Sunni Muslims.
Yep.
They still believed in hereditary leadership.
Right, and that's where they were like, well, our family was elected, so then that should be hereditary. So it's really like a lot of people were like, well, that seems not right. And that started to undermine, one of the things that undermined their rule.
So then how did non-Muslims get to that?
Well, leadership is just like, who's the caliph?
Oh.
And then, and that's a good question and a good thing to always remember. That term bureaucracy is like, who's going to institute what the leader says. So, even if you're the most totalitarian ruler, you're still going to have a bureaucracy. You're still going to have those departments like the Tang did in order to govern. And I don't know why I can't remember the Islamic Empire's dates off the top of my head. So the Abbasid Caliphate comes next. They are less welcoming of outsiders. Yep. They expand over to North Africa. They are the group that opens the door to conquest of Spain. Right? So an offshoot of the Abbasid Caliphate will take over Spain, and an Islamic group called the Moors will end up conquering and ruling Spain for more than 700 years. And one of the things that I suggested to my own students is that you look at a couple areas that were impacted by Islam, and you should be able to compare and contrast like how much they were impacted. So if you look at India, if you look at Spain, if you look at West Africa, if you look at Anatolia, those are typically the 4 areas that they could potentially ask you to try to compare and contrast the impact of Islam. So, in general, when you want to think about the area that was most impacted by Islam, it will be Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. And even though Spain has like 700 years of being governed by Muslims, they still retain a really strong allegiance to the Catholic Church. So Spain, West Africa, India, even though they are all at times governed by an Islamic group, they don't become nearly as Islamized. Sorry, I couldn't spit that word out. Islamized. I'll have to edit that out of the video. They don't become as Islamized as Anatolia. So, all right. For the sake of time, I'll give you the Mongols really quickly, more by kind of who they govern and how they govern. So I think probably most of you guys know a little bit about the Mongols and their rise to power. So the Mongols, they were pastoralists, right, which means they were kind of semi-nomadic. Genghis Khan was able to unify the Mongols at a time where there was not a lot of unification there. Some of the really cool things about the Mongols and Genghis Khan are things that you wouldn't necessarily think. The Mongols, because they didn't have a religion, they were pretty religiously tolerant. And Genghis Khan also wanted to kind of break the power that people had to their like ruling families and their former like really fragmented way. So Genghis Khan instituted in the military and his bureaucracy a meritocracy. So he said our army is going to be built not from like who your father is, but rather what you do. And the other part of the Mongols that a lot of people don't know is that they often were really diplomatic. Now, they were diplomatic in a way that always had a hovering threat of violence, which is like they'd show up at your doorstep and be like, hey, we're going to conquer you violently, or you could just agree to let us govern you and pay us taxes. But a lot of times students, like they'll talk about the Mongols without understanding that role that they would have diplomacy play. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just looking at a study guide that I have.
Yeah.
And do you know what the term Mongol Khanates are?
Yeah. So the Khan was the Mongol term for leader. And after Genghis Khan dies, the Mongol Empire was divided into smaller Khanates.
Oh.
Right. So the term Khanate are just the smaller Mongol empires, right? So when the Mongols are ruling China, we call that the Yun Khanate, and so it's just smaller pieces. So if you know a little bit about Russia and a little bit about China, that gives you a good point of contrast for Mongol rule. So the Mongols conquered Russia in a pretty violent, militaristic way. But then what the Mongols did was they allowed the Russian princes to continue to govern. So they didn't want to directly rule Russia, partially because the Russian land was not really great agriculturally. The Mongols were really reliant on their horses, and their horses did not do particularly well in Russia. So for the Mongols, the conquest of Russia and then the conquering or the ruling of Russia was really indirect. Sorry, I'll write up here. I know you guys in the back struggling to see. So the Mongols in China are called the Yun dynasty. And when the Mongols go in and take over China, they really put the Chinese population in a secondary role. Like they weren't even allowing Chinese people into government. So this is a period of really direct Mongol rule over China. Right, and a direct Mongol rule that really changed the social structure. In general, in the Mongol empires, men and women weren't quite equal, but they were on relative equal standing compared to China. So when the Mongols come in with their women who are a lot freer to go out, in the cities and society than Chinese women, the Chinese saw this as like really, a strange cultural piece. The Mongols also, when you look at socially, they were really interested in trading. Therefore, merchants were promoted to high positions in the Mongol government in China. So this was really taking thousands of years of Chinese society and kind of putting it on its head. Because China had been one where during the Tang period, women are having their feet bound to show their submission to men. And now it's like, no, Mongol women are riding horses and they're training for the military, and they're really utilizing women as relatively equal in society. And again, the merchant class is really raised up. So the Mongols were not content just governing China. So they tried to conquer Vietnam. They tried 3 different times to conquer Japan. And overall that military, those 2 military expeditions were just really expensive. And the Mongols were already not very popular amongst the Chinese people. And the Ming will finally come in the 1360s and overthrow the Yun, and China goes back to being in the Confucian ways, and the Ming are really gonna strongly go back to Confucianism. So Mongol rule is direct, changed a lot, try to conquer, right, and fail, and that's kind of one of those things that is a reoccurring theme of empires, is that they overexpand, and that overexpansion often gets them into a lot of trouble. Yeah?
Is Persia and Mongol not?
Well, I suggest that you pick 2 areas that the Mongols govern and know those 2 areas really well. So your options would be Russia, China, Persia, and I just focus on Russia and China because how easy they are to contrast. Yeah.
Is it like the Mongols destroyed Persia?
Yeah, and that was the question, was about Persia and is it important to know? Mongol rule or Mongol conquest of Persia was most destructive. Again, I just gave you the 2 that I think are easiest to contrast. Yeah.
What language do the Islamic people speak?
Arab. Well, I mean that's a hard question because Islamic people were people from all over the world. So they spoke the languages of their areas. So like in West Africa, West African Muslims spoke whatever language they were there. In general, they were learning Arabic, so they were able to read the Quran in the original Arabic form. But it didn't always mean that they would then speak Arabic. So there's no they didn't all speak anyone. Yeah.
What systems did the Mongols adapted from China?
So they still use the same system of departments in the government, right, that the Tang had put in place, but they abandoned the examination system and they really move away from Confucianism. So they keep the same structure of the government, which people, the average Chinese citizen living away from the city of Beijing, which is where the Mongols are going to center, probably didn't see a lot of difference in rule. That's another thing about the Mongols in China. They try to do all these unbelievably huge building projects. So the Mongols tried to vastly expand the Grand Canal. They wanted it to run farther south. They tried to build an even bigger imperial city in Beijing. And they're just spending a massive amount of resources that are impoverishing the Chinese people even more. Okay, why don't we take like just a mini break? I'll clean the board, and then I'll come back and I'll get us through the end of period 4, I guess. And then we'll just meet up in Surge and lunch, and maybe after school, and get through periods 5 and 6. Or maybe I'll just like stay here alone from like 12 to like 1:30. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, like, I'm not doing anything besides homework.